So what we're going to do next is we're going to make these tabs clickable. Currently they are not clickable. I can't really do anything with them. To be able to solve that, we're going to progressively enhance the page so that if the user doesn't have JavaScript on, the page will look like this. Let's go into our code. Currently the tabs are being controlled by the H3 element. Each of the tabs is wrapped inside of an H3 element that has a class name of tab header, and then each one has a unique ID name. So this one is the third tab, it's called tab-header-3. You can see the second one is called tab-header-2, and the first one is just with a 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to add event listeners to the headers. Now there's a lot of different ways that we could do this. We're going to do one that is pretty explicit and maybe not quite as efficient as we could make it, but I think it'll illustrate well what's happening, and then once we do that we'll kind of clean up our code a little bit and make it a little bit more robust. In order to do this, we are going to be working with get element by ID, and what we want to have happen is we want to get the ID of each of these tabs. So I'm going to start off by creating some variables just so that my code can be a little bit easier to see. After we have our initialization where we're adding that ready class to the tab group, we're going to define the rest of our code. So I'm just going to put some returns in here, and we're going to create a variable called tab1. We'll make that equal to document.getElementById, and then we'll pass on the name of the actual ID that we want to get. So in this way I can just refer to the tab header 1 as something more concise. I'm just going to be able to call it tab1. And we will copy this line of code and do this for the other two tabs as well. So we'll make one for tab 2 and one for tab 3. The tab header is what I want to make clickable, and since each one has an ID, we can get those, and then once we have them we can start to do something with them. We're going to create event listeners for each one of our tabs. So what we're looking for is the click event, and then once we hear the click event we're going to add a function that will actually do something when the tab is clicked. I'm going to add the event listener to the tab respectively. It's going to be triggered by a click, and when it hears that click, then we're going to call something called activate tab, because that's what we want to have happen. We're going to use a named function in this case because we're going to repeat ourselves, and using an anonymous function here would mean that we'd have to repeat the function every single time. So using a named function means that we can just repeat it and pass in the variable. Let me go ahead and create the listeners for the other two tabs. And now let's create the function for activate tab. Because we are dealing with an event listener, we can pass in the event parameter. So we're going to create a function called activate tab, which is the same name that we're calling up here. Then we're going to have this be triggered by an event, so we'll pass on the event parameter. And then we're just going to message the console and let the browser know that that tab was actually clicked. So if we save our page and if we switch over to the browser and refresh, when I click on these tabs you can see that I'm getting a message that says heard a click, and you can see that now it's happened 2 times, now it's happened 3 times, and so on, and it'll just keep listening for those events as many times as I've clicked the tabs. So we have these event listeners on each of these, and it took a few lines of code to get there. I'm going to show you a little bit of a different way to do the same sort of thing. Because we have not only IDs on our tabs, but we also have class names, we're going to use the tab header and then an ID. So instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, we could do this as a loop instead. So let's try to incorporate our loop, which will allow us to select a single element by the ID, or we could get a bunch of elements using their class. And using this method, I can get those document.getElements, and if I'm grabbing more than one by class name, then we need to pass on the name of the class, which in this case is simply tab header. So let's comment out these lines of code right here. Since we actually don't need them, I'm going to use the block comment. So it starts with a /*, and then where I want the code to end, I will use */. And in this way, I'm disabling this bit of code right here, so it's no longer going to affect our page. What we'll do is, once we've assigned the ready class to the tab group, we're going to now create a variable called tab headers. I'm going to make that equal to get elements by class name and pass on the class name of tab header. Then we'll create our for loop, and this is going to look familiar to you because it's something that we've done in previous lessons. I'm going to create a variable with the name of I, set it to have a value of 0, and then I will go through the length of tab headers, and as long as the length of tab headers is larger than I'm going to continue to add 1 to that number. Now that we have the variable called tab headers, we're going to add an event listener to the click, and when that is heard, we'll run activate tab. So I'm using the get elements by class name. I'm grabbing more than one class name in that I'm specifying the tab header, and then I'm going to pass that class name, which is tab header, and I'm going to call this variable name tab headers. So now that I have all these, let's see what it looks like in the browser. I'm going to save my page, and if I go into the browser and refresh, now when I click these, you can see that we're still hearing the click. So in this way, it's working the same way. We've now just coded it so that it's using a loop instead of using the code that we had before. This is a little bit more of an efficient way to utilize our code right here. And because we're using the loop, it's giving me an array of each of those elements, and one of the best things that we can do with an array is to use our for loop to do something to each one of them. So what we're doing here is we're adding the event listener. The same event listener is getting added on to each one. So just to be clear, I'm using the same function on each of these because we want to keep things nice and neat. Now we're going to want to activate a different tab every time one of these is clicked, but we can do that inside of a single function. So I'm going to loop over these and add the same event listener to each one, and we're going to use our friend the for loop here starting at 0, and we're going to go on until we reach the length of the tab headers array, stepping by 1 every single time. And then we're adding the event listener to each tab header by using its index in the array. And our activate tab function is exactly the same as it was before. So now I have a function that's going to react every time one of these tabs is clicked. Of course, it's not doing much yet, but it's ready to actually take some action, and we'll do that in the next exercise.